So I'm a big fan of creating color tokens using Figma variables, irrespective of how big or small a project might be. Now that being said, crafting semantic color variables or tokens for a project or design system is no joke. Names need to be clear enough to guide designers, but flexible enough to grow with the system. Alright, so before we dive into naming strategies or any Figma wizardry, let's get one thing straight. What exactly are semantic color variables? Take these two examples. The first one on the left is an open state variant of a dropdown. The menu item's hover state has a color F5, F7, FA. The second example is an alert component with its background or surface color being E6 FFF2. Now these colors are raw hex codes, and ideally I want to define them with variables. And so while defining my color variables in Figma, I define two types, the primitives and the semantics. Now primitives are mapped to hold the raw hex values. Note in this example, gray 200 is the primitive that holds the value F5, F7, FA, and green 100 is the primitive mapped to the value E6 FFF2. So primitives are straightforward. They're basically named after the color and spectrum they are in the color ramp. The problem I have with hex values or primitive variables is that they are not telling me how I might apply it to an element or component. I could use gray 200 anywhere. As for the semantic variables, they are mapped to the primitives I defined initially. So rather than just slapping a label like gray 200 for color, the semantic variable BG surface primary hover tells me how the color is to be used. BG tells me it's a background color, and surface primary tells me it is used on a surface of a component and that it's the primary or the lightest shade. The term hover tells me it's a hover state. So not only does this make it easy for me to apply colors, it also helps maintain consistency when applying colors to different elements. We use semantic variables to have a shared language to make life easier. But on the flip side, we have to come up with names that are easy to understand, consistent, and can scale. I have a taxonomy that I stick to, but this can vary depending on your team or company. So this is the taxonomy structure that I stick to while creating semantic variables for colors. I shall refer to this structure in the rest of this video. This schema talk, called Design Tokens on Asana's Design Systems team in 2021 by the Asana design team, goes into how they structured and named their tokens. And this is very similar to the taxonomy in the first image. So I have come across a few other ways designers structure their tokens, but I find this taxonomy most intuitive. This taxonomy is also more or less closely aligned with the simple design system created by Louis Auriac in Figma. Now the token structure, if you note, maps out to 4 distinct categories. The first one is the element. So in the beginning, it's helpful to map what it is you would usually apply colors to. And as you can see from the image of this card component, colors can be mapped to being applied to 4 elements in any component: the surface or backgrounds, text, icon, and borders. Secondly, think about the semantics of the color concerned. Is there a brand color? Are they supporting colors like success, warning, or danger? And maybe a color for an error or success text. Map them. What about the hierarchy of the concerned element you might be applying a color to? For example, you might want 2 types of background colors, a primary and a secondary color. And maybe you want a strong text color against a light surface and a weak text color against a dark surface. Finally, we have different states the component could assume. Few examples being hover, pressed, focus, and disabled. Now there's no perfect method. Every design system or even individual component has its quirks, and you have to embrace the chaos a little to get it right. So take these badge components for example. It's BG for element, and positive, warning, danger, and brand for semantics. Notice the default in the token name. This is for the hierarchy. I would need positive or danger or any semantic color to have a dark and a light shade. And I prefer the weak notation for the hierarchy. Also, maybe you need an even lighter shade. I don't know, maybe. So this is where you need to trust your eyes and decide for yourself. Of course, the image may not seem to show you a stark difference between weak and weakest, but I prepare for the worst and create another variable here. So the default is the dark shade and the weak and weakest give me the light shades. So you see the pattern here? So you have an element semantic hierarchy token structure like BG brand default, BG brand weak, BG brand weakest. And if you use these colors for components like buttons, you may also need a hover and a press state as well. So the token structure would then have element, semantic, hierarchy and state. BG brand hover and BG brand pressed. BG brand weak hover and BG brand weak pressed. BG brand weakest hover and BG brand weakest pressed. This way, this notation could extend across all my semantic colors assigned to backgrounds. Rather than BG brand default, I could do away with default and just have a BG brand. Now this works fine too. Similarly, notice the name BG brand hover. I named it this way rather than BG brand default hover. It works either way. If you think this way, you could plot a mental map, a matrix of sorts, to tabulate the combinations of variables you may need. Extend the same strategy to text and icon. I would require a dark text or icon against a light background and a light text icon against a dark background, which would mean text brand default and text brand weak, icon brand default and icon brand weak. And now consider the states as well. And you would have text brand hover, text brand pressed, text brand weak hover, text brand weak pressed. And the same would apply to icons as well. Mapping variables with neutral colors is where things get a little tricky, especially for the backgrounds. Rather than have a common name for BG across all my neutral colors, I want to differentiate between pages or screens, housing the components, and the components themselves. What do I mean? Let's take this example. Notice the page itself has a color called BG base, whereas the components like the header, the tabs, and the card that sit on the page have the color BG surface primary. Essentially, I am assigning those elements with the higher level of prominence as BG surface, whereas the lowest level of prominence in terms of depth would be the page itself, which has BG base. This gives me a little more granular control when I flip to dark mode. I can make the components look a little elevated with the same tokens. Now there are 4 elements for which you assign colors: background, text, icon, and border. Each of the 4 elements could have neutrals or grays and semantic colors like brand, positive, danger, and warning. Now hierarchy for the neutrals that define backgrounds usually go from light to dark. So primary would be lightest and tertiary would be darkest. But this would be just jumps of 1 to 2 shades like 100, 200, 300 and so on. However, the hierarchy for the text, icon and border neutrals would be from dark to light. Primary would be darkest and tertiary would be lightest. For the BG semantics, you could have extremes of hierarchy, a dark shade and a very light shade. Hence, it may be better to use something like BG brand default, which could be brand 600 or brand 700, and BG brand weak, which could be brand 200 or brand 100.